Hello again, and welcome to the Temporal 3 podcast. I'm joined by my co-host, Mr. Chris Godwin,
Hey, everybody.
and Mr. Charles Aulner.
Howdy, I'm Charles.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me, guys. So today I'd like to start out talking about some things that we have learned from our fire alarm inspection and testing workshop. And if you're new to NTC or not aware, we do offer a fire alarm inspection and testing workshop. We do offer it as a in-person class, but more popularly and on a very regular basis, we offer it as a virtual class where you get to watch us do the work. And it's a very popular class, and our students end up learning a lot because a lot of our students have some very common misconceptions about what inspection and testing requirements are for fire alarm systems. So, Chris, you do these. You're the primary host for a lot of these. What's one of the most common things that students don't realize that they learn in our class?
Can I use magnets to test my smoke detectors? One of the biggest and most common things is, well, we do it this way. We're allowed to do it. No, you're not. Not for a functional test, at least. It's not
Bingo.
a functional test. It does test that circuit works. It does show that if you are able to trip the relay inside, activation happens. And for that aspect, sure, it's not a functional test, however. And every class, we get that question of, well, what about magnets? You can't. It's actually in code that for the functional test, for a smoke entry test, magnets are not permitted.
Yep. Exactly, and it even says in the table itself in 14432. Now, unfortunately, it's at the end of the table, and one of the notes, one of the informational notes about it, but it specifically says that magnets are not a functional test because the function of a smoke detector is to detect smoke, and introducing a magnet does not introduce smoke to the detector. Charles, from your real world experience, what have you seen?
I've seen a lot of folks get confused about what a sensitivity test is, what a functional test is, what a magnet test is. People don't understand all that, and they certainly don't understand the difference between an inspection and a test. So they don't know where to look in the code, first of all, chapter 14. And then in chapter 14, they don't know what table to look at, inspection or test. And right in the test table, it identifies how to do the test, what the requirements are for the
Yeah.
test. And people are just unaware of that. When we talk about sensitivity, functional inspection or testing, they get all that jumbled up in their head.
Yep, absolutely. And Charles, you bring up a great point and something that I love pointing out to people, both our NISET students and our fire alarm inspection and testing students, that table, in addition to having the intervals, has the methods, even has the inspection methods, what you have to look for on an inspection, which is really cool because now you have something to go to that is in writing that says, okay, for a functional test, you do this. For an inspection, you do that, and it tells you exactly what to do, what to look for, and that's huge. And I think you're right. A lot of people just totally ignore that or don't read far enough to the right to see that information in the table. Chris, one that I've seen and one that surprises people in the classes that I've done is differential pressure testing of duct smoke detectors. And it's been in the code for a couple of years. And when we talk about a manometer or a magnehelic gauge, and are like, what the heck is that? I've never seen that, and explain them. And, it's a requirement of the code. It's been in there a couple of cycles.
It definitely has. It's been in for quite a while. Um, from a field perspective, not a lot of technicians are doing this, and a lot of it comes down to it's not really a lot of AHJs enforcing it, is what I've seen. Now, you gotta do this differential air pressure testing with your duct detectors. We do it for your externally mounted duct detectors because you need to make sure that the amount of airflow coming in from the supply tube to your exhaust tube is not so much that it's flushing straight through. I do kind of look at this as a bit of an issue, again, more on the AHJ side of it, But also, that's not something that from a fire alarm technician's perspective, we can actually control. What you are measuring, again, is how much air is going from one side to the next within the enclosure that is where the smoke head is kept. You use a tool called a manometer, or Brian, what's the other one called?
Magnahelic gauge.
Yeah, yeah, no
That's old
idea.
school analog, man. I
Yeah,
know you're a digital kind of guy. You're a millennial, Chris. You're a digital kind of guy, but a lot of us old guys like the old analog stuff.
yeah, and you utilize that to make sure that the pressure coming through or that the air movement is not in excess.
Yep. So basically, what Chris is saying is, for our listeners out there, we need to make sure our duct detectors suck air in from the sampling tube and put it out the exhaust tube. Charles, you missed that one. You should have. I was expecting you to say that. Chris, is there something else that our students frequently do not realize about duct detectors?
You got to do sensitivity testing. You got it. It's a smoke detector. Now, that being said, with how sensitivity testing is done, if it's monitored through the panel, we don't have to do it.
Yep, exactly. And that's commonly overlooked because I don't think people realize a duct smoke detector, or we commonly call them duct detectors. It is technically a duct smoke detector, is still a smoke detector. So we still have to do all the testing we do on the spot type smokes, including the functional test, including the sensitivity test. Charles, for notification, fire alarm acceptance, we do something with the notification. What do we do with our notification appliances when we acceptance test it?
Well, before I get to that, smoke detectors require sensitivity testing. Brian, do you require sensitivity testing as well?
I'm a very sensitive guy.
Really?
I think anybody that knows me will argue about that.
Well, on the notification side, we need to check for sound level and make sure we have the adequate sound pressure level from our audible notification devices. And there's a strobe intensity requirement as well, that we need to make sure that we are meeting. Normally, both of these are analyzed and calculated and developed in design. So out in the field, there's not a problem unless there's some malfunction or something, typically, or a change in the environment.
Yep. So that's initial acceptance that we require, as Charles said, we get out the. I used to say Radio Shack. Nobody knows what Radio Shack is anymore. So I'll say Amazon special dB meter and go 5 feet above the floor and measure the ambient sound level and make sure that we're meeting that. And the strobes, you don't need a light meter. All you need to do is go to the strobe and check the candela on the strobe. That's it. But that's only on acceptance. And unless you do a modification of the system, or as Charles said, a significant modification of the environment, it is not required to be done periodically. And that's a common misconception that I've encountered. We have to do an annual sound level test and an annual verify the strobe intensity. Nope, only on initial acceptance. That's it, or reacceptance. The one difference here, though, that I like to throw at people, and this is something that many people are less aware of because it's something relatively new in the code, is mass notification, which actually does require both of those to be done as part of the annual testing. And that surprises a lot of people. And that would even apply if you have a combination mass notification and fire alarm. Guess what? More stringent requirement applies for the mass notification part. You got to go around with strobes and look at the setting, and you got to go around with the dB meter and check the sound level.
And Brian, does that apply to voice evac systems as well? Is a
Oh,
voice evac system considered a mass notification system?
no, it does not. Voice evac is fire alarm. Charles, great point. Yeah, voice evac is ECS, emergency communication, but ECS does subcategorize chapter 24, subcategorizes emergency voice alarm communication or voice evac versus mass notification. So it's kind of interesting. That's only an MNS requirement, but not a fire alarm. And who knows, maybe some point in the future it will be a fire alarm. But right now, at least up to 2025, it's only a mass notification requirement.
And making that distinction clear is important.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It makes a lot of sense that we've got to do it for mass notification. If the fire alarm activates, even if it's a voice evac system, what's the message every single time? Get out. Get out. mass notification, it makes sense that you want to have that, ensuring that you have the right sound levels because the message might change. So, I mean,
Good
with that
point.
in mind, yeah, it makes a little bit more sense that we do that annually.
I hadn't thought about it from that perspective, but you're right. Yeah, because with a mass notification, there could be a shelter in place, there could be an evacuation, there could be a muster call, and knowing that that message is at an adequate level to be heard and understood is definitely something that I could see the point in that, Chris. I hadn't really considered that.
The day has come
The day has
where
come.
Chris, after reading the code, actually thinks it makes sense. What is wrong with you?
I don't know. I'm playing my lottery numbers today because obviously the end is nigh here, guys. Somebody thinks one of us thinks the code makes sense.
That aspect of it.
That aspect, one aspect. Chris has to caveat it. We don't want
One
him to have them committed or anything.
Mm.
Awesome. Well, the next thing I'd like to talk about is NFPA 72 Chapter 10. 10 is a very important chapter. Chapter 10 is fundamentals. And something that's covered at the end of Chapter 10 is enunciation zoning. And one of the things it talks about is the requirement or when a remote enunciator is required. Now, I know a lot of fire alarm people think, well, a remote enunciator is always required. Well, that's not necessarily the case. Chris, what would trigger a remote enunciator to be required? Why does the code, or what does the code have to say about that?
Um, a lot of the times, what I've actually seen from the field is, um, the requirement for the when is an AHJ thing. A lot of times, the
Sure.
AHJ wants them, and that's
Yep.
because of what they're used for. Yeah, from a fire alarm technician's perspective, I can use that to do inspection and testing, and I have to go back to the panel. I can reset from there. It's easy. But what the whole purpose of the remote enunciator is to make the information about what's going on in the system much more readily accessible to your first responders. Where's the panel 9 times out of 10? It's not at the front door. It's in the back of the building behind a locked door. Having a remote enunciator at a lot of times the entrance and exits points gives the fire department, when they come in, the ability to say, okay, here's the enunciator, here's what's going on, and see what floors, which build or which devices and everything else within the building are activated, so they can more appropriately go deal with that.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that how many of our customers want a giant red honking fire panel by their front door? That just doesn't appeal to the aesthetics of the building. Can't make it
Well,
blend in.
yeah.
So they put it, and it's better for the panel too to have it in a locked electrical closet or sprinkler room or something, so it doesn't get messed with. But you're right, unless the fire department knows where that room is and has access to that room, that's a significant delay in their ability to respond. And remember, guys, that while the primary purpose of fire alarm systems is to notify building occupants for that evacuation, there's also secondary purpose as far as the indication on the fire panel to let the fire department know exactly where the fire is. So they know where to go. So they know how to handle the situation. So, what are some of the zoning requirements, Charles, from NFPA 72?
Well, I think it's important that we identify what a zone is. Typically, when we talk about zoning, it's thought of as a conventional fire alarm panel as opposed to a point of detection that you might refer to for an SLC. The principles are the same, though. Uh, we can't have a zone of a fire alarm be a whole multi-story building. So each floor of the building has to be individually zoned. There's a size limit too. Annex A specifies a size limit for how big a zone can be in terms of square footage. We can't exceed that. Otherwise, 1 million square foot could potentially be a zone, and that doesn't tell responding authorities anything about where the fire activation might be. So that limitation is important. Chris, what is that floor square footage limitation?
The square footage limitation, and again, Annex A materials, not always enforceable. 22,500 square feet. 22,500 square feet is what we look at from a square footage perspective on. Your zone should not exceed that. That's a pretty big area still, but
That is a very big area, and they
Bryan, how
talk
many zones could your house have?
a quarter, not even, maybe a tenth, probably not even that much, maybe a 20th. Yeah, you got the requirement too, and Chris mentioned Annex A, which is up to the AHA as far as enforceable. And I like to the analogy I like to use with Annex A is that it's guidelines, it's best practice. It's my wife telling me you really should take out the trash. What's she doing? She's telling me you shall take out the trash, but she's trying to say it in a nice way. Doesn't care if the Super Bowl's on or anything like that. That's not important. But fire and smoke barriers are another delineation, and no more than 300 foot in one direction. All again in Annex A of Chapter 10, but something that we should be applying as designers in every system, because again, it's best practice. And as Chris said, or Charles, I'm sorry, if you said the zone is 1 million square feet, you could argue, well, the code doesn't say it can't be. Okay, fine. How's the fire department going to know? And especially if it's not an addressable system, know exactly where the fire is. That's a lot of area to cover. It's interesting too that there's a similar requirement. Charles, you mentioned addressable, that there's similar requirements for SLCs in Chapter 23. Chris, you want to talk about SLC requirements from Chapter 23?
yeah, coming out of Chapter 23, 2361 states that a fault shall not cause loss of more than one zone. Okay, what does that mean? It means we got to have separations. Your SLC loops, you're able to T-tap off of them. Depending on the size of your panel, you can have multiple devices tied to a single SLC loop. Well, that could take up, multiple rooms in a building. It could take up, if we're not going upwards, you could have several parts of the building fall into one zone. What happens when you got a ground fault to that zone? Everything's lost. The whole system's lost. So no, you go into Annex A material and it breaks down a little bit more of that separation for the SLC side of it. A lot of the same requirements that we just talked about for regular zoning from Chapter 10's perspective. Floor area, 22,500 square feet. Smoke, fire barriers. Your circuit should not extend more than 300 feet circuit distance any one direction. But now it's being applied specifically for your SLCs.
Yep. It basically parallels. I'm sorry, Charles, go ahead.
One thing I want to point out, we throw out this abbreviation SLC, signaling line circuit. That's an addressable circuit. A notification circuit, which is totally different, is typically not an SLC. So an SLC is a signaling line circuit, an addressable circuit. A notification circuit is what we connect to our horns and strobe.
Absolutely. And if anybody who is a student of the code, I strongly recommend. Chris mentioned 2361 as the SLC requirement, loss of more than one zone. A fault shall not cause a loss of more than one zone. There was extensive Annex A material in A2361, including illustrations, which I'm a big fan of illustrations, about how to do that zoning. So as a student of the code, here's your homework for our listeners. Take a look at your 72, look at A2361, read that annex material, better understand how to zone your SLCs. So gentlemen, our question from the field today is, what do I need to know about project management for NISET Fire Alarm Level 3? Chris, what's your personal feeling about the Level 3 exam?
Level 3 is hard. Level 3 is very hard. We've been told from NISET it is one of the hardest exams that they offer, not just in fire alarm, and incredibly difficult to pass. And a lot of what you find being the frustration and the difficulty is the project management section, because it's stuff that NISET expects that you know or have been experienced with, but there's no book. There's no book to take in. There's books to study, but there's nothing to take in. And when you get into the project management at level 3, it's not contextual. There's not background information for the situation they're giving you. It's just, here's the situation. So your answers are a lot harder to try to figure out, because if you go into it with, how would I do this out in the real world, you're not going to answer correctly. It's a what you should do. What would a book tell you to do? That is how you want to go about a lot of the project management when you get into that level 3 exam is what should you do based off of a book?
Charles, how would you compare and contrast NISET project management versus real world project management?
Uh, project management is squishy.
Yes.
It's done in all sorts of different ways, and there are training courses that are weeks long on the subject, depending on what you want to get involved with. So there's not so much a right and wrong as better or less good, is how I might phrase that. The biggest piece of advice I can give to students is NASCLA. Get the NASCLA book. Uh, Chris mentioned when you're in the test, look for a book answer, not a real world answer. And that's very good advice. But studying the book beforehand, the NASCLA book will give you that information in your head. And always go with what's more stringent. Chris calls it a book answer. I tend to agree with that. If you find an employee drinking on a job site, should you shoot them in the head or give them a nice, gentle counseling and maybe send them home until they sober up?
Ask if they brought some for you. And if they didn't, then you send them home.
But
I don't
a lot
remember
of
that
our
part of the
students,
NASCLA book.
yeah, a lot of our students struggle with that project management stuff because NISET Level 1 is code-based. NISET Level 2 is intensely code-based. NISET Level 3 is project management-based. What would you do in a squishy situation? And we're so accustomed to that, find it in the code, find it in the code, find it in the code. We hit these other types of questions where there's no reference allowed, and our brain is stuck in, where would I find drinking on the job in the code? Well, it ain't in there.
And I agree, Charles, in that NASCLA book. The good news about the NASCLA book, yes, it is an investment. It's another book, and it's not allowed in level 3, but it's great prep material. But it is allowed for level 4. And our approach is that, look, at some point, if you're level 3, you're going to get that additional 5 years of experience you need in fire alarm and go for level 4. We always encourage maxing out your certification. And when you go for level 4, you're already going to have the book. And get it now, get the basic edition, don't get the state specific edition, and just be prepared. So, Chris, are there any? Charles mentioned some things that looking for textbook answers. Any other things that you could recommend from your experience with it, as far as a guide? Again, not having a reference, how would you approach a question?
Um, Sometimes it's going to be what would a book say? Sometimes it's going to be what's the most obvious thing? A lot of times the project management stuff is okay, that's obviously the answer, but we're so conditioned to how NICET does things to look at it and say, no, it can't be that easy. Sometimes it
Right.
is.
Yep.
The best case or best choice of action when it comes to having no idea, whatever, take a guess and just keep on going.
Yeah,
Yes, it
man.
is a large portion of your exam. It'll be somewhere between 25 and 30% of your exam. 70% of the exam's going to come out of a code book. 30% is from this project management. You're going to want to get some of these correct, but don't overthink it. Don't be wasting time on it because there's nothing to go back and look in at level 3. Remember
Good
your
point.
chain of command. Project
Yep.
manager is probably going to be the best answer for who do I go to? Probably going to be going right with that. So
Yep.
be familiar with those
Absolutely.
things.
I'd say
Well,
the other thing is, go ahead, Charles.
go
Sorry.
ahead, Brian.
I was going to say the other thing is familiarize yourself with some of the paperwork involved in project management, like insurance, like bonds, like labor law. And the NASCLA book is great for that. And a lot of students will say, well, I don't deal with that. We have somebody in our office that deals with that. And I understand that. But in NICET world, somebody who's going for level 3 is basically the local project manager for a project and has some knowledge of those things. And even though, don't think about what you do in your job on a daily basis, think about what NISET expects. And NISET expects somebody to understand basics of labor law and OSHA requirements and bonds and insurance and, kind of have a cursory level of knowledge of that type of stuff. Charles?
One thing you mentioned is in the test, and I think this is an important concept in test taking, you're going to run into questions that you don't have a reference for, and there's just no obvious answer. It's like when your wife says, "How do I look in this dress?" Well, there's no right answer there. And
No.
thinking about it for 5 minutes isn't going to come up with one.
Let me get
Just
you in more
pick
trouble.
one and move on. Get rid of it, pick it, go on to the next thing that maybe you've got a better chance of getting an answer for.
Absolutely. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you again for your participation in this program. I want to remind all our listeners to please subscribe, and we'll see you all next time. Thanks again,
Thanks, Bryan.
guys.